Welcome back to our CGTN special, Moving China Forward, as we discuss the 19th Communist Party Congress that's just taken place in Beijing over the last week. China's top leadership gathered to discuss plans and goals for the country over the next 5 years and beyond. Let's get back to our panel. Wang, let me go to you. Let's talk about the environment. This is a big issue for China, especially air quality. How does China move forward on improving its air quality? How does it get to the balance of economic progress and at the same time not sacrificing its environment?
Well, I think over the years you've seen lots of measures taken by the central government and the party to overhaul this issue. Last time I was in Beijing was this February. Frankly speaking, out of 4 weeks that I was there, I only remember 3 smoggy days. Lots of innovative measures such as drones to clean up the environment, overcapacity issue, which is also related to environmental degradation. In northern China's Hebei province, for example, they overproduced the steel in excess is the equivalent of the entire output of their European Union. I'm talking about steel production. So all those things must be taken care of, and the party realizes it. And so no new permits and licenses will be given to these companies, factories that produce excessive steel, things along that lines. And also I think it's important to raise people's awareness how to reduce their carbon footprint, how to buy electric cars, how not to produce CO2 emissions. The president realizes it. He went to Alaska a few short months ago and met with the governor there to forge cooperations to buy more natural gas, to reduce the coal-fired power plants. I think those are policies in the right direction.
Yukon Huang, the environment was one of the big important issues addressed by this Congress. President Xi talked about building a, quote, beautiful China. When we look at issues like air quality, the environment, ecological protection, what are the main challenges that China faces?
Well, you've noted one fundamental difference today compared with 5 to 10 years ago. That is the political commitment and wills there. You have a 300 million consumer class, largely in cities. They're affected. The leadership is affected. So the political will is completely different than it was 5 to 10 years ago. There's also a greater recognition about the economic implications. In the West, we tend to think of environment or climate change as bad for GDP growth or bad for business. The Chinese have realized you can actually turn this around. You can actually make addressing environmental issues good for business. So you get into green technologies, you get into new equipment, you get into research, you get into a different kind of urbanization pattern. And in the process, you can actually say to yourself, there's not necessarily a drag on our growth rate. It can actually be a plus. So having combined what I would call the political concerns on top of the economic concerns, that's why you easily see that China wants to play more of a leadership role on environment and climate change issues today compared to what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah. Right, Stephen, let's look at that broader issue of climate change. China is also taking a leading role in the fight against climate change. It played a leading role in the formation, or at least the formulation of the Paris Accord just over a year ago. Will the world now look to China for leadership on this issue?
Well, first, Dr. Huang made such an important point, one which is often not understood, which there is not a contradiction between environmental sustainability and GDP growth, that you can shift the economic model to a way that you continue to have good GDP growth. And that is what I think President Xi understands that. And I think he is seeking to implement that kind of policy. I think also the movement to a more service-based economy in China is going to have implications for environmental sustainability. Obviously, you move to services, you're creating much less pollution, so that's important. In terms of world leadership, I think you have to look at in combating climate change, reducing CO2 emissions, you have to look at it in 2 ways. One is businesses and NGOs, and second is government. The U.S. business community and NGO community remains committed to doing everything in their power to reduce CO2 emissions in the United States and kind of adopt environmentally sustainable business models. And that is going to continue. And that means those parts of the American community are going to continue to work closely with Chinese businesses, the Chinese government, and Chinese NGOs. So that has not shifted greatly in the course of the last year. the U.S. government role has clearly been reduced. That President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords is an important symbol that the U.S. government is not going to be leading the world in doing this. The U.S. business community and NGO community will continue to play that leading role, but it's going to fall to the Chinese government to try and set the example for the world, and we have to see how that happens. Is China going to be able to adopt policies which may not help certain industries in China, but would be beneficial to the world?
Zhang Weiwei, so the 19th Party Congress has finished. Let's look at the big picture here. The party amended its constitution and enshrined President Xi's thoughts on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era as part of its action guide. How would you assess President Xi's thoughts in shaping the future of China?
Well, it will be very influential for the future of China. If you look at the evolution of the political ideologies since Deng Xiaoping, essentially started with a focus on economic modernization, and then to Jiang Zemin, focusing on economic, political, and cultural development. Then Hu Jintao, he add another dimension, social dimension. And now with Xi Jinping, he add environmental, ecological dimension. So 5 dimensions: political, economic, social, cultural, and environment. So in his new doctrine, you find that in each of these 5 categories, 5 domains, he has certain new ideas. On the political front, he emphasizes improved the party's leadership and fighting corruption. In the economic domain, he emphasizes, innovation as really looking for upgrading China's existing industries and embracing the new economy. In the cultural domain, he's the greatest advocate of Chinese traditional culture and values. And in the field of ecological civilization, really he's campaigning for this whole idea of renewable energies. So flowing from these ideologies, this new doctrine come with the Chinese really devoted efforts to drive the new economy, the renewable energies that set China apart from Donald Trump's United States.
Cheng Li, President Xi emphasized several times during the Congress that China is not interested in any kind of world expansion, hegemony, if you want to call it that. What is the message that is sending to the world?
This is still very much in line with Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao's ideas that there should be a peaceful rise of China. China still should emphasize its own development domestically. And yes, China will not separate it from the outside world, but it should be a constructive force rather than become part of a problem. I personally believe what Xi Jinping said. And the challenge is you should have a better communication with outside the world, especially with United States and Europe, to express China's interest, concern, challenges, and why we should not think that China's rise will be at someone's expense. Why China's development will not be expansionist in terms of military expansion or economic expansion, etc. Why it should be win-win. So you should benefit the people outside the world. So this is what Xi Jinping said, to make a cake bigger, so people can benefit from that. So until that can really deliver, I think that you will still see some cynicism, some concern from outside the world. And also not only just the economic things, but also what happened in China in terms of political, social development also will make a huge impact for outside the world, how to look at China. And I hope that there will be more communication in this area. I think Xi Jinping surprised us in the first 5 years, the first term, but I hope that he will continue to surprise us with improvement in what I call unbalance. The unbalance could also mean unbalanced situation between economic growth and the political constraints or bottleneck. And if that happened, really could put China in much better shape and much better appreciated by Western world.
Stephen, China is endeavoring to play a bigger role in world affairs, a constructive role, as Cheng Li just pointed out. But will there be resistance from other countries in the world, from the United States?
I think the United States will, again, there are factions with, you can't say the United States. There are factions in the United States who are going to oppose China's peaceful development. So you can't say, I think the U.S. government, to the extent that China is playing a responsible stakeholder role in the world, they're going to have support from the United States government. The United States government is not going to look at BRI and say, don't do this. The United States government isn't going to look at peaceful activity for China and say, don't do this, to the extent that there is conflict with U.S. interests. So to the extent that there are issues in the South China Sea, which the U.S. government perceives as conflicting with U.S. interests, that's going to create problems. To the extent that China can't do enough on North Korea to satisfy President Trump, that's going to create issues in the U.S.-China relationship. But by and large, the description that President Xi laid out in his speech is one which Americans will by and large accept. What I think is important is exactly what Cheng Li said about the communications aspect. I would suggest that in the next 30 days, the new members of the Standing Committee actually go on a world tour and describe to each of the countries who are important partners of China what this all means. Because the media covers it, but hearing directly from Chinese leaders is important. President Trump will get to hear it directly from President Xi 2 weeks from now. Right. But the American public needs to hear directly from the Chinese leadership what this means. There are 5 new members. Wang has been in charge of the economic side of U.S.-China relations for a number of years. It's important that the people of the world actually hear directly from the Chinese leadership of what this means for their lives. Because I think when articulated what it means for their lives, it's very positive. It's not a threat. It's something which is going to improve the lives of everyone. But as much as these wonderful panelists speak, the members of the Standing Committee speak, and people listen much more carefully.
Wang, I've got a little time left in the show. As you look back on this Congress, of course, a number of issues discussed were examined, policies formulated, now plans will be implemented. What is your impression of all those issues that were discussed?
Well, Nan, I've been covering 2012 and 2016 U.S. presidential elections, went on a campaign trail for a little bit, and now covering the Communist Party's Congress from here in the United States. I can say that one is focused on long-term consistent strategies, while the other perhaps is focusing more on short-term political gains. Here in the U.S., for example, last year, exactly a year ago, you see lots of 10-second sound bites and 15-second campaign ads on television. But for the CPC, you see long-formatted speeches, lots of policy discussions, debates on issues. Some of my Western friends said, well, those are a little long, maybe a little dull. Well, if you get into the thick of issues, if you debate issues, those, of course, may seem a little dry, but at the end of the day, those issues may find their way into the Constitution, into the strategies 30, 40 years down the road and serve the country well.
Okay, final thoughts from Professor Zhang Weiwei. I've just got about 30 seconds. Professor, would you consider this a successful Congress?
Well, it's overwhelmingly positive for most Chinese, whether at the academia or for the ordinary people, because people expect the slogan "Beautiful China," which really relates to ordinary people. People like it.
Okay, that's where we are going to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for our CGTN special program, Moving China Forward. And before we go, I just want to remind you that you can find much more of CGTN's extensive 19th Party Congress coverage on our digital platforms. And please join us on CGTN America's Facebook page or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.